The universe, as it turned out, was rather like a cosmic high school cafeteria, complete with cliques, hierarchies, and an alarming number of beings who thought they were more important than they actually were. At the top table sat the ethereal consortium, those insufferably enlightened energy beings who had transcended physical form approximately 3 million years ago, and never let anyone forget it. They communicated through interpretive quantum fluctuations and had the collective personality of a philosophy professor who'd discovered meditation and wouldn't shut up about it. One tier down lounged the crystalline hegemony, silicon-based life forms who had mastered matter manipulation to such a degree that they could literally reshape reality with a thought. Naturally, they used this godlike power primarily for interior decorating and creating increasingly elaborate throne rooms. Their idea of profound discourse involved lengthy debates about geometric aesthetics, while lesser species waited centuries for audience permissions. The middle management of galactic civilization belonged to the techno-syndicates, a collection of cybernetic species who had merged so thoroughly with their technology that distinguishing between organic and artificial intelligence had become a philosophical exercise in futility. They ran the galaxy's bureaucracy with the cold efficiency of a computer and the empathy of a tax audit, processing uplift applications with all the warmth of a restraining order. Then came the various biological federations, empires, and republics, carbon-based life forms who still required things like atmosphere and nutrition to function. These quaint beings clung to their physical forms with touching determination, engaging in what the higher tiers considered charmingly primitive activities like eating, breathing, and experiencing linear time. They were tolerated much the way one might indulge a child's insistence on keeping a pet rock. At the very bottom of this cosmic food chain, filed somewhere between interesting geological formations and potential mining hazards, sat the classification for primitive species. These were worlds that had discovered things like fire, agriculture, and basic metallurgy, but hadn't yet figured out faster-than-light travel or quantum consciousness. The galactic bureaucracy maintained detailed files on such species, primarily to ensure they didn't accidentally strip mine their home systems before the primitives had evolved enough to become proper slaves or entertainment. That unremarkable blue marble orbiting an equally unremarkable yellow star in what the galaxy's mapmakers had designated Sector ZZ9 plural Z Alpha, the galactic equivalent of filing something under miscellaneous junk drawer, held the dubious distinction of being classified as subcategory primitive, potential concern. The potential concern tag wasn't because the inhabitants showed promise, quite the opposite. It was because they showed an alarming tendency towards self-destruction that might contaminate nearby systems with radioactive debris. The hegemony's official assessment, filed in triplicate and stamped with 17 different bureaucratic seals, read like a cosmic performance review written by someone who particularly disliked the employee. The humans, it noted, had developed nuclear weapons before achieving interplanetary travel, engaged in constant tribal warfare over resources they possessed in abundance, and had somehow managed to pollute their own atmosphere while simultaneously strip mining their planet's surface. They were, the report concluded with characteristic understatement, suboptimal candidates for uplift protocols. What made this assessment particularly amusing to the galaxy's upper tiers was humanity's complete ignorance of their cosmic irrelevance. The species had actually convinced itself it might be alone in the universe, a delusion so charmingly narcissistic that several ethereal consortium members had begun monitoring human broadcasts for entertainment value. The idea that these barely evolved primates might consider themselves the center of creation was comedy gold to beings who had witnessed the rise and fall of 10,000 civilizations. The techno-syndicates had run probability calculations on humanity's likelihood of achieving meaningful space travel before rendering their planet uninhabitable. The odds were roughly equivalent to a drunk mathematician successfully performing surgery while riding a unicycle during an earthquake. Most betting pools gave the species another 2 centuries before they either evolved beyond their violent tendencies or became an interesting archaeological exhibit for future visitors. This cosmic condescension wasn't malicious exactly. The galaxy's upper echelons didn't hate humanity any more than a gardener hates weeds. They simply viewed them as a minor inconvenience to be managed. Occasionally, junior diplomats from the middle-tier civilizations would suggest intervention or uplift programs, But these proposals invariably disappeared into bureaucratic black holes deeper than actual black holes. The irony, of course, was that this elaborate hierarchy of cosmic smugness had been constructed by beings who had forgotten the most fundamental rule of evolution. Adaptation wasn't about becoming more civilized, refined, or philosophically enlightened. It was about survival. And survival, as the galaxy was about to discover in the most unpleasant way possible, was something these primitive, violent, resource-depleting primates had mastered with a thoroughness that would have impressed their distant ancestors, who had once turned wolves into lapdogs and learned to make fire from nothing but stubbornness and opposable thumbs. But that revelation lay ahead, waiting like a cosmic punchline that nobody saw coming. The decision to finally contact Earth came about the way most galactic policy decisions did, through a combination of bureaucratic boredom, administrative oversight, and the kind of casual arrogance that only came from eons of assumed superiority. A mid-level functionary in the Techno Syndicate's Department of Primitive Species Management had been reviewing quarterly reports when they noticed that Sol 3, as Earth was officially designated, had somehow developed rudimentary space travel without proper authorization form. This was, according to Protocol 8472 subsection 12, a clear violation of the Natural Development Accords. Primitive species were supposed to submit applications for technological advancement at least 50 standard cycles before attempting anything more sophisticated than steam engines. The fact that these humans had bypassed the entire process and gone straight to launching metal cylinders beyond their atmosphere was not just irregular, it was administratively inconvenient. The response was swift, decisive, and utterly predictable. A first contact diplomatic mission would be dispatched to bring these upstart primitives into compliance with galactic regulation. The mission's objectives were delightfully straightforward: assess the species' technological capabilities, establish proper bureaucratic oversight, and if necessary, implement corrective measures to ensure future compliance with established developmental protocol. The diplomatic vessel that arrived at the edge of Earth's solar system was a masterpiece of intimidating engineering. A crystalline construct the size of a small moon that bent space-time around itself like a cosmic origami project. Its very presence warped local gravitational fields in ways that would have given human physicists migraines for decades. To its crew of highly evolved beings, it represented the pinnacle of civilized achievement. To any primitive species, it should have inspired immediate surrender, and hopefully some decent groveling. The mission commander, a being whose species had transcended physical form, roughly the same time humans had discovered pottery, approached the task with the enthusiasm of someone asked to explain mathematics to houseplants. The preliminary scans of Earth confirmed everything their files had predicted: a chaotic world of competing nation-states, primitive energy sources, and technology that barely qualified as adequate for asteroid mining. The humans' response to their arrival was unexpected. Instead of the usual pattern, panic, religious hysteria, followed by desperate attempts at communication, Earth's governments demonstrated a coordination that the diplomatic team found mildly concerning. Within hours of the vessel's appearance, the planet's military forces had achieved a level of unified response that seemed mathematically improbable, given their documented history of constant warfare. The first transmission from Earth was equally puzzling. Rather than the expected pleas for mercy or offers of tribute, the message was remarkably concise: state your business or leave our system. The tone suggested the kind of confidence typically reserved for species that possessed planet-killer weaponry, which according to all assessments, humans decidedly did not. The diplomatic team's response followed standard protocol. They transmitted the Universal Declaration of Compliance, a document that had successfully intimidated over 12,000 primitive species into immediate submission. It explained in terms simple enough for basic neural patterns to comprehend that Earth was now under galactic oversight and would be expected to conform to established developmental guidelines. Non-compliance would result in what the document diplomatically termed administrative consequence. Earth's reply arrived 17 minutes later. It consisted of a single word that, when translated through the diplomatic team's linguistic matrices, roughly corresponded to no. This was not in the manual. The commander's subsequent attempt at clarification, surely the primitives had misunderstood the gravity of their situation, was met with increasingly detailed explanations of exactly what humans intended to do with their diplomatic vessel, their compliance to, and several anatomically impossible suggestions involving various pieces of their advanced technology. The turning point came when the diplomatic team decided to demonstrate their superiority through a show of force. A single energy pulse, calibrated to disable Earth's primitive satellites, was fired from their vessel's forward array. It was meant to be educational, a gentle reminder of the technological gap between civilized species and planetary primitives. The pulse never reached its target. Instead, it encountered something that shouldn't have existed according to every assessment in their files: a planetary defense grid of staggering sophistication. Energy shields materialized around Earth with the kind of seamless precision that suggested not just advanced technology, but battle-tested experience. The diplomatic vessel's demonstration of power was absorbed, analyzed, and apparently filed away for future reference. The commander's growing unease transformed into genuine alarm when their sensors detected massive energy signatures emerging from what their scans had identified as primitive military installations. These weren't the crude nuclear weapons their files had documented. These were coherent energy systems that registered on scales typically associated with stellar engineering projects. The humans, it seemed, had been hiding their capabilities with the kind of thoroughness that bordered on artistic. Every assessment, every scan, every piece of intelligence gathered over decades of observation had been carefully manipulated to present exactly the picture the galaxy expected to see: a primitive, violent species barely capable of leaving their own atmosphere. The reality was considerably more complex. As the diplomatic vessel found itself surrounded by human ships that had somehow appeared without triggering any of their detection systems, the commander experienced what might charitably be called a moment of philosophical clarity. The galaxy's intelligence services had not failed to detect advanced human technology, they had failed to detect human intelligence. The difference, while subtle, was proving to be tactically significant. The final communication from Earth before the situation deteriorated completely was delivered with the kind of cheerful professionalism typically associated with customer service representatives announcing policy changes. Your vessel is in violation of our territorial sovereignty. You have 30 seconds to begin departure procedures, or we will interpret your presence as hostile action and respond accordingly. The commander's response, a haughty explanation of galactic law and the consequences of threatening superior beings, was interrupted by proximity alarms throughout their vessel. Somehow, impossibly, human forces had not only surrounded their ship, but had begun what appeared to be boarding operations. The last coherent thought the commander managed before everything went sideways was a recognition that perhaps, just perhaps, their assessment of human primitiveness had contained a small margin of error. This realization arrived approximately 2 seconds before the first human boarding parties materialized inside their vessel, through technology that, according to all known physics, should not have been possible for a species that still used fossil fuels for transportation. The galaxy was about to learn that humans had a particular talent for exceeding expectations, especially the wrong ones. The boarding of the diplomatic vessel proceeded with the kind of methodical efficiency that would have impressed a Swiss clockmaker, if Swiss clockmakers specialized in interdimensional warfare and had access to weapons that violated several fundamental laws of physics. The human boarding parties moved through the alien ship's corridors with a familiarity that suggested they had been studying similar vessels for considerably longer than anyone in the galaxy suspected. What struck the alien crew as particularly unsettling wasn't the humans' advanced technology, though the personal force fields, molecular disruptors, and what appeared to be handheld reality editors were certainly noteworthy, but rather their complete lack of awe. These primitives were treating one of the galaxy's most sophisticated vessels like a particularly interesting museum exhibit, poking at control systems with the casual curiosity of tourists examining ancient artifacts. The commander, whose species had spent the last million years perfecting the art of condescending telepathic communication, found themselves on the receiving end of what could only be described as professional courtesy. The lead human boarding party member, a figure whose appearance suggested extensive genetic and cybernetic enhancement, approached with the demeanor of someone conducting a routine inspection. Your vessel's design is quite elegant, the human observed, examining a quantum processing core that had taken the crystalline hegemony 3 centuries to perfect. We've been working on similar configurations, though our approach to dimensional folding is somewhat different. Would you mind if we took some measurements? The casual expertise with which the human discussed technologies that supposedly didn't exist on Earth was perhaps more disturbing than any threat could have been. This wasn't the bumbling ignorance of a primitive species stumbling onto advanced concepts. This was peer review.
As the reality of their situation became increasingly clear, the diplomatic vessel's crew began to appreciate the elegant thoroughness of human deception. Every probe, every scan, every intelligence-gathering mission had been carefully managed to provide exactly the data needed to maintain the illusion of primitive development. The humans hadn't simply hidden their technology, they had created an elaborate theatrical performance, spanning decades, complete with staged conflicts, manufactured limitations, and carefully orchestrated discoveries that followed precisely the developmental curve expected by galactic observers. The true scope of human capabilities began revealing itself as their forces systematically dismantled the galaxy's most sophisticated intelligence network. Monitoring stations that had operated undetected for millennia suddenly found themselves visited by polite human technicians who apologized for the inconvenience, while downloading centuries of accumulated data. Stealth satellites throughout the sector simply vanished, leaving behind only faint energy signatures, and the growing suspicion that they had been discovered, studied, and recycled into more useful configuration. The galaxy's communication networks, those vast quantum entanglement arrays that connected civilizations across thousands of light-years, began experiencing what could charitably be called service interruption. Messages were delayed, rerouted, or arrived with subtle modifications that suggested human editors were taking creative liberties with interstellar correspondence. The Techno-Syndicate's attempts to coordinate a response found themselves hampered by communication systems that seemed determined to route all emergency transmissions through what appeared to be a human customer service center. But perhaps the most psychologically damaging revelation was the discovery of humanity's true military doctrine. The galaxy's civilized species had spent eons refining warfare into an elegant art form, massive fleet engagements conducted according to established protocols, with clearly defined rules of engagement and mutually agreed upon limitations. It was warfare as performed by beings who viewed combat as an extension of diplomacy, a regrettable but occasionally necessary means of resolving disputes between rational entities. Humans, as it turned out, had a rather different philosophy. Their approach to warfare could be summarized as whatever works, a doctrine that encompassed strategies ranging from the merely unconventional to the actively horrifying. They employed tactics that more civilized species would never consider, not because they lacked the capability, but because such methods were regarded as unsporting. The humans seemed to have missed this particular memo entirely. Fleets that attempted to engage human forces found themselves facing opponents who refused to follow established combat protocols. Human ships appeared and disappeared without warning, striking from directions that shouldn't have been accessible, and employing weapons that seemed designed more to cause psychological damage than physical destruction. They targeted infrastructure, supply lines, and command networks with the systematic thoroughness of a species that had clearly studied their opponent's organizational structures with uncomfortable attention to detail. The ethereal consortium's attempts to intervene through their usual method, overwhelming displays of cosmic power designed to remind lesser beings of their place in the universal hierarchy, encountered an unexpected problem. Humans, it seemed, were remarkably resistant to intimidation. Rather than cowering before demonstrations of stellar engineering, they responded with what could only be described as professional curiosity, taking detailed measurements and apparently reverse engineering transcendental technologies in real time. The psychological impact of this response rippled throughout galactic civilization like a quantum shockwave. Species that had spent millions of years secure in their technological and philosophical superiority suddenly found themselves questioning fundamental assumptions about the nature of intelligence, development, and cosmic hierarchy. If humans could achieve such capabilities while maintaining the appearance of primitive barbarism, what did that say about the reliability of the galaxy's entire classification system? The answer, as more and more civilizations were beginning to realize, was nothing particularly comforting. The final straw came when human diplomatic representatives began appearing at major galactic forums, arriving uninvited and apparently unconcerned by the complete lack of invitation. They participated in debates with the casual confidence of equals, offering perspectives on cosmic policy that demonstrated an understanding of galactic politics that should have taken centuries to acquire. Their proposals were invariably practical, devastatingly logical, and implemented with the kind of administrative efficiency that made the techno-syndicates look like amateur hobbyists. Within a span of time that civilized species would typically use for preliminary feasibility studies, Humans had established themselves as a major galactic power. They hadn't conquered through overwhelming force or transcendent philosophy. They had simply demonstrated that they belonged at the table, and that anyone who disagreed was welcome to try removing them. The galaxy's reaction to this development was, predictably, panic.
The transformation of galactic civilization's collective psyche happened with the kind of speed typically reserved for stellar collapses and cascade failures in quantum computing systems. Within a single galactic standard cycle, humanity had evolved an alien perception from quaint primitives to existential nightmare fuel, a metamorphosis that would have impressed evolutionary biologists if they hadn't been too busy updating threat assessment protocols to appreciate the irony. The ethereal consortium, those insufferably enlightened energy beings, who had spent 3 million years perfecting their cosmic smugness, experienced something their species hadn't felt since achieving transcendence: genuine fear. Their emergency session, conducted through interpretive quantum fluctuations that now carried undertones of barely suppressed panic, focused on a single, terrifying question. If humans could hide their true nature so effectively, what else might be lurking in the galaxy's supposedly primitive sectors? The paranoia spread like a particularly virulent meme through the galactic communication networks. Suddenly, every backward species became a potential threat. Agricultural worlds that had been dismissed as harmless were subjected to intensive surveillance. Mining colonies found themselves under scrutiny that bordered on the obsessive. The galaxy's intelligence services, already reeling from the catastrophic failure of their human assessments, began second-guessing every piece of data they had ever collected. The crystalline hegemony's response was characteristically theatrical. They retreated to their core systems and began constructing defensive installations that resembled cosmic monuments to anxiety. Their matter manipulation technology, previously used for elaborate interior decorating, was repurposed to create fortress worlds that could theoretically withstand assaults from species with human-level cunning. The fact that they were building defenses against an enemy they didn't understand, using strategies based on assumptions they could no longer trust, was an irony lost on precisely no one. The middle-tier civilizations found themselves in the most uncomfortable position of all. Too advanced to claim ignorance, too primitive to match human capabilities, they occupied a cosmic middle ground that felt increasingly like a target-rich environment. Their diplomatic corps worked overtime to establish non-aggression pacts, trade agreements, and mutual defense treaties with Earth, displaying the kind of desperate enthusiasm typically reserved for insurance salesmen at natural disaster sites. Human diplomatic representatives, meanwhile, approached these negotiations with the same professional courtesy they had shown while systematically dismantling galactic military capabilities. They were perfectly reasonable, entirely rational, and absolutely terrifying in their competence. Treaties were negotiated with surgical precision, extracting concessions that left their negotiating partners feeling like they had been professionally pickpocketed by master craftsmen. The true genius of humanity's approach became apparent as the new galactic order stabilized. They hadn't sought to dominate through conquest or intimidation. They had simply demonstrated that they were the most competent species at the table, and that competence in the hands of beings who had spent millennia perfecting the art of survival was perhaps the most frightening force in the universe. The galaxy's new mythology began writing itself in the whispered conversations of beings who had previously considered themselves apex predators. Humans became the subject of cautionary tales told to young civilizations. The species that smiled while they outmaneuvered you, who offered friendship with one hand while calculating your weaknesses with computational systems that put quantum processes to shame. They were the monsters who looked like prey, until you realized you were the one being hunted. Cultural anthropologists throughout the galaxy found themselves studying human behavioral patterns with the kind of academic fervor typically reserved for understanding cosmic phenomena. The humans' casual relationship with violence, their ability to form cooperative bonds under stress, their tendency to innovate solutions to problems that shouldn't have had solutions, all of it was documented, analyzed, and filed under reasons to avoid provoking terror. The irony wasn't lost on the galaxy's philosophers, who had plenty of time to contemplate such things while their civilizations rebuilt their entire understanding of cosmic hierarchy. Humanity had become exactly what they had always been, adaptable predators with an inconvenient tendency toward cooperation and innovation. The only difference was that the galaxy was finally paying attention. Trade relationships with human-controlled space operated under protocols that would have seemed familiar to anyone who had ever tried to negotiate with a particularly intelligent apex predator. Respectful, cautious, and conducted with the understanding that the other party was perfectly capable of ending the conversation in ways that involved significantly more violence than anyone wanted to contemplate. The techno-syndicates, their bureaucratic efficiency suddenly seeming quaint compared to human administrative capabilities, found themselves relegated to junior partner status in their own sphere of expertise. Human technological integration proceeded with the kind of systematic thoroughness that turned their carefully constructed regulatory frameworks into historical curiosity. The fact that humans accomplished this while maintaining the appearance of following proper procedures was perhaps the most impressive display of bureaucratic warfare the galaxy had ever witnessed. Children throughout civilized space grew up with bedtime stories featuring humans as the monsters under the cosmic bed, beings who looked friendly but possessed capabilities that violated basic assumptions about how the universe was supposed to work. These weren't the traditional monsters of galactic mythology, the ancient evils or cosmic horrors that threatened to devour worlds. These were worse. They were competent neighbors who might decide you were a problem that needed solving. The ultimate irony revealed itself as the galaxy adapted to its new reality. The cosmic hierarchy that had existed for millions of years hadn't been overthrown through conquest or revolution. It had simply been exposed as the elaborate fiction it had always been. Power, it turned out, had never belonged to the most enlightened or transcendent species. It had always belonged to whoever was best at surviving. And survival was something humans had been practicing since before their ancestors had figured out which end of a stick worked better for hitting things. The day humanity became the monsters in galactic mythology was the same day the galaxy discovered that the real monsters had always been there, waiting patiently at the bottom of the food chain, perfecting the art of being underestimated. And now that they had everyone's attention, they were perfectly content to demonstrate why that had been such a catastrophically bad idea. The universe, as it turned out, had always been a cosmic high school cafeteria. The only thing that had changed was who was sitting at the head table, and how politely terrifying they were while they ate their lunch.